Hello again everybody, and welcome to Test Flight in the F-5 Tiger II. Now this is a module that was just released in early access format by the developer Bellsum Tech, the same guys behind the F-86, MiG-15, HIP, and Huey helicopter. So I have high hopes for the quality of the module that we're going to get here. Now this is the F-5E model, so it entered service in the mid to late 70s and was used by the Air Force and the Navy primarily as an aggressor aircraft, simulating enemy aircraft in a training environment, but it was also exported to a number of different countries, too many to even go through right now. I'll probably have like a list of some of them slip by on the screen right now, and is still in service actually with the Navy and with a number of these countries in either a primary first-line fighter role or in a lead-in trainer role. So if you're not familiar with what the Test Flight series of videos is, I'm going to go through my process of learning an aircraft from scratch, starting from the very beginning. This is the second time I've run this instant action mission. The first time was just to map some different controls, and this second time was just to record some footage and have a quick tour of the cockpit so that we know what to expect once we get into figuring out the procedures and performing things step by step. We'll have some familiarity with where these panels and these switches that are called out in the procedures are in the cockpit. And I better back off of this guy. He's sort of fluctuating in speed on me, and that usually means he has a turn coming up. I think he turns left, actually. That's what he did last time. So this isn't necessarily intended to be a tutorial, although a lot of people do follow along and learn the aircraft with me as I go. And it's not intended to be a review, although you will be able to tell for yourself whether this is something you would be interested in or not. If I weren't enjoying it, I frankly wouldn't fly it and definitely wouldn't show a video of it, so take that for what it's worth. Now at this point, I've obviously been through the manual. The manual for the aircraft is available on your C drive once you get the aircraft installed. I'll have a link flash by on the screen right now that shows you where it is. It's really hidden. I wish there was a better place that these could be at, and it was a little bit more obvious where to go to find them, but this is the location. And I also have as a reference, and I'll bring up the Kneeboard right now, I'm going to have a combination of the aircraft manual that is provided by the developers, the -1 flight manual, this is the real flight manual for the F-5E that I have up right here, and the -34 weapons delivery manual that goes into details on how to use the radar and how to employ the various fire control systems and weapon systems we have on the aircraft. So those I'll be referencing in the cockpit, and since I am recording this in VR, I'm going to augment the cockpit view heavily using these different manuals. And having been through the different manuals, I have an idea of what systems are present in the aircraft and generally how they work. What I usually do right now is use the first couple of times I take the aircraft up to map some basic controls. For example, the axis that I use for a pitch, roll, yaw with the rudders, the throttle, and just some various HOTAS, hands on throttle and stick functions with the different buttons and the different switches you can see on the stick and throttle. These I have already mapped, and then I just basically go around the cockpit just to see in general how things are laid out, so that the next time I go back to the manual and read through it, I have the experience of having seen it in the cockpit to back me up. And that's how the learning process goes on these, and that's what I'm trying to get across here to new players, just trying to give some example of how to go about learning an aircraft. And it always starts with reading, performing, and then rereading the manual. And that second rereading always yields just a ton of things that you wouldn't have picked up on otherwise. And at that point, then I can start going into systems, then I can start going into procedures with a solid foundation to work upon. So let me just go ahead and start with the basics. We'll just make a sweep around the cockpit and see in general what's here and what everything is and where everything is. So starting at the back left, I have a circuit breaker panel, and we'll get into the details on that once we get into the electrical system. I have countermeasure controls, so I have switches for chaff and flare, and I also have it's actually on the throttle on this aircraft, isn't it? Okay, I'll go ahead and punch off, I think. Yeah, I think I heard them come off, a chaff and a flare. I'll punch off a few more so you can see it in the external view. So it looks like we have one chaff bucket and one flare bucket. 15 is what we started with on flare, 30 is what we started on chaff, and that might be configurable in the mission editor. We'll see what options that we have there, but that's where you go for countermeasure controls. Okay, we have some flight control system controls here, so pitch and yaw dampers, and this is just an augmentation system for keeping the nose steady. For example, with the pitch and yaw damper on right now, I'll try this just to see what the effect is. I'll just input just a quick little input aft stick, so the nose comes up and it just basically stays there. Now let me turn off the pitch damper. And I'll do the same thing, just a quick aft stick input, and yeah, you can see the nose oscillate up and down. So what happens there is that the pitch damper, well, does exactly what you would think it is. It damps out that oscillation in pitch. So instead of taking, 3 or 4 cycles of oscillation to damp out on its own, just aerodynamically, the pitch damper is going to help that along and just sort of keep the nose steady, and that's going to work the same in pitch and yaw. And then I have rudder trim right there. Okay, moving forward to some radar system controls. So we have a slew control, elevation, we have a lock button, and we have 4 position switches for off, standby, operate, test for the radar itself. And then we're in the 40-mile scan. As you can see down here on the radar display, we have the 40 displayed to the left, so the display at least is giving us indications for any aircraft out in front of us at this elevation that we're looking at for 40 miles. Okay, we'll get into more detail on that as we get into weapons employment. Okay, coming up to the throttle, pretty straightforward. We have some speed brake controls right there that I was using as I was doing some formation flight there at the very beginning. Chaff and flare we already saw. And then the flap system, we have a maneuvering flap system that is going to help us out as we get into some low speed maneuvering. So the controls for this are sort of twofold. We have a main control lever back here. So let me see, we have an emergency up setting, we have a full setting, and then we have a setting that's going to have the flaps controlled by a switch on the throttle, and the throttle switch is a 3-position switch. It looks like it's auto, fixed, and up for the selections right there. So right now it's in the auto setting. So let me actually try this. I'll just put it into a bank and put a load on the aircraft, and what we should see, okay, we have a flaps indicator up here to the top left, and let me pull the throttle in. Yeah, there we go. Flaps are in auto right now, and as they go to the different regimes, and I think this is just based on a number of factors, I think primarily angle of attack. So there you go, as the angle of attack changed and the different inputs to the CADC, it's like a very, very simple flight control computer that's present in the F-5. Based on the inputs, it's going to automatically position the flaps to the different settings that we need to get the optimum performance out of the aircraft. So okay, I think for the most part I'm just going to be leaving that in auto, but we will check as we get further into the series all the different functionality of that. Okay, so we have a switch over here on the left side, nose strut switch, and this is going to extend and retract, or hike, I guess is what it's referred to, the nose gear, to give us, once we're on the runway, a nose up, a nose pitch up attitude, and that's going to greatly cut down on the takeoff roll and greatly cut down on the takeoff speed required to get the aircraft airborne. So we'll see that in action once we get onto the runway and get into the takeoff, and then we get into armament system controls. So a lot of controls here, but it is a very, very simple system, just different switches for the different pylons. We have different settings for safe, rocket, slash dispenser, bomb, ripple that we'll be looking at. And we have different fuse arm settings and interval settings for the ripple releases. It seems complicated, but boy, it really isn't. And yeah, we'll see that in action once we get into the weapons employment, and we have some jettison controls to the right of that. Now above that we have our primary flight instruments, so these are just the standard instruments that you would see in any basically US aircraft, so no surprises there. To the left of that we have landing gear controls and a drag chute T-handle. So once we get onto the landing roll, we can pull that. That's going to deploy the drag chute and help us slow down on the runway. And then to jettison it, I believe in this aircraft is going to be to jettison, you rotate counterclockwise and pull again. For our purposes, it'll just be a click to extend and then probably just a click to jettison. But yeah, we'll see that in action once we get onto the landing roll. And then in the center, we have really the meat of the fire control system. And that's going to be the gun sight and then the radar display down below that. Now the gun sight is going to give us cues for range when we're doing aerial gunnery. It also gives us cues for range for firing the A9s, and that's really all that we have as far as air-to-air. There are no radar-guided missiles on this aircraft. It's just a radar that locks onto a target and gives us ranging information for missile and for gun fire control information, and that's going to be displayed, and we can see the reticle, the basic reticle up there, and we'll have a whole lot of other symbology associated with the reticle once we do get behind an aircraft and lock it up. And then different controls. Now we're going to get into using, I'll switch this over to manual. Once we get into air-to-ground gunnery, rockets, and bomb delivery, we're going to be using a sight depression setting right here. And you can see as I choose the different settings right here on this dial, the reticle depresses to an angle expressed in mils from the zero sight line. So right now it's at 91 mils below the zero sight line, and that's just going to give us an estimation of, based on an airspeed, dive angle, and either slant range to target or altitude above the target, where we can expect a bomb or a rocket or a round fired from the gun in the air-to-ground realm to fall. So we'll get into this. It's actually very, very simple once you get the basics, but it gets just infinitely more complex the more and more precise you want to get with this system. So we'll be spending a lot of time on manual rocket delivery and manual gunnery. This is the perfect aircraft to really delve deeply into that on. But for now, I'm just going to put it back to the missile setting. Actually, I'll just turn the gun sight off. I don't need it for anything that we're going to be doing from here on out. And then the radar display is going to give us cues on where aircraft are in front of us. Now, I'll get this set up. Maybe at the very end, I'll try to lock up. Looks like on my RWR, and that's to the right of this display, I have another F-5 and an E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft out there. So RWR, and this is very similar to the F-15 or the A-10, just your standard Western RWR display here with controls above it that we'll get into more detail on. To the right, we have engine instrumentation, okay, hydraulic system pressures for the utility and flight control system above that, so engine instrumentation below it, nozzle position, fuel flow, fuel quantity indications, and let me see, on my, actually speaking to that, on my master caution panel, I have an external tanks empty caution light, so for my read ahead, I know that I need to go external fuel tank switch off, that extinguishes the light, and it shuts off the pump that would have been, in theory at least, bringing fuel, if there were any, lifting the centerline tank into the main fuel tanks. And you can also see that I have a fuel imbalance, and this is going to be something that the pilot spends a lot of time managing, and that's the fuel balance, because we have, I think it's the right tanks are larger than the left tanks, so you're going to run into a lot of situations where you have more fuel in the right tank than the left tank. So to rectify that, and to make sure that you don't get into any like weird balance issues on the aircraft, we have an auto balance switch over here to the right and below the indicator. So I have the left hand tank low, so I'm going to go to the left low position, and that's going to automatically balance. So it's going to feed fuel from the right hand system into the left hand engine and balance it out. Okay, then ECS, cabin temperature, pressurization, defog switches, pitot and engine anti-ice switches right here, and then to the left of that we have communications and navigation. It's just a single UHF radio on the F5, so that makes radio communications a snap, and then just additional navigation controls for TACAN or directional finding. Below that, more circuit breakers down there on the console below it, and moving over to the right, a caution warning panel and oxygen controls. We saw the caution warning panel in action just earlier. Above that, electrical system controls. Very, very simple controls here, just a battery switch and two switches for the generator. Okay, below that is the IFF panel. Now, IFF is, well, it's not really modeled extensively in DCS to begin with, but the F5 is going to have a transponder, but not an interrogator. So other aircraft locking us up or seeing us on the radar will be able to tell whether we're friendly or enemy, but if we have something in our own radar, we won't be able to interrogate and tell the difference between a friendly and enemy aircraft. So it's not really going to be an issue, because to get in close enough to take something out, we're going to be within visual range, probably to use these AIM-9s, definitely to use the guns. So identification of aircraft is not really going to be an issue, but that will be something to sort of keep in mind and to pay attention to as we go and we get into weapons employment. Okay, so below that we have some lighting controls. Now I'll turn these on. This is something that I'm trying to get into the habit of doing for VR, because what I'm finding is that for VR purposes at least, even in the daylight, it's easier to read things and easier to pick out what you need to pick out on engine instruments or just panels around the aircraft in general, if you have, at least the floodlights on, or whatever lighting options are given in general on the aircraft. So I'm trying to get into the habit of just always turning them on. I never did it on a 2D screen because I just don't like the way they look on a 2D screen for whatever reason. Okay, then coming around to the right, okay, we have a map case and a map light above that. More circuit breaker panels back there to the back. So as you can see, this is a very, very simple aircraft to operate. I mean, there's really not a whole lot going on here. Even I guess the most complicated part of it, just from the looks of it, is going to be the armament control panel, but even that is very, very simple once we get into the concepts. It's just stuff that Like, for example, on the A10, we just do through the display, through the Dismas. You know, those functions are still here in the F5, but they're just, instead of by pressing buttons, you're just flipping switches. I mean, everything is laid out in a way that just really makes a whole lot of sense, with all the flight instruments in one place, engine instrumentation in one place, armament in one place, communications in one place. It's an aircraft that I feel is not going to take very long at all to learn the basics of. So it's one of those aircraft that strikes me as very, very easy to use, but very, very hard to master, especially, I believe, when it comes to air to ground. But folks, I'm going to break in here after the fact as I edit this video together, because I have another 10 or 15 minutes of this first introductory flight where I explore some of the handling characteristics of the aircraft. So I'm going to come back next time with the remainder of this mission, and then have a quick look at the interface to see what sort of training modules and missions are included with the module at this point, keeping in mind that this is still the early access version and not everything is going to be there. And then I'll step straight into the aircraft startup, the taxi, the takeoff, and weapons employment for the F-5. So if that sounds interesting to you, feel free to stick around. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.